when I was bar mitzvahed, I had this, when I was 13, I had this stand that enabled me to do this, but I was surprised to discover that for the first time since my bar mitzvah, they've given me a stand so I could look tall enough to handle the job and the task before us. I am delighted to be here, and I thank this introduction. I thank my fellow board members and President Daniel Arena and ACOP for the work it's doing. And they've asked me to come and speak about the meaning and lessons from President Trump. And I'm doing this actually from a written text. And I never speak from a written text. I always speak from handwritten notes and bullet points and elaborate. But one consequence of the election of President Trump has been the urgency of writing as much as possible for people to understand the political moment that we're in, and so that you can impact strategy. My wife came to I should mention that my wife came to a previous meetings of the conference, but with Donald Trump, you can't leave America. You have to be there every day to be involved in the resistance, to understand how the best way to challenge and fight that force, those anti-democratic forces in America. And so as a consequence, in the last couple days, the New York Times published a piece that I wrote about the nature of the Republican Party. The American Prospect yesterday published a report on how to respond to the agenda of the Trump administration. And so as a consequence, I'm going to probably do this in a more halting way than I'm used to. I understand it is much better for the translators that they have a text to work from. And so I will do my best to use an actual text, but also elaborate and give you some depth and feeling on what is happening there. Now, what I believe for sure is that the disruptive Trump victory and surprising victory in 2016 has and will strengthen the nationalist, anti-establishment, anti-immigrant, anti-Islamic and authoritarian parties against the globalist parties, as Steve Bannon described them. I don't accept that grouping of globalist parties because the opposition is of a very different character, but it serves the right to describe all the parties that are opposing those parties as globalist. There's much more, I think, that distinguishes those opposing those nationalist parties, but that's how they define the conflict. And so I do think Trump's victory, I do think his speech in Warsaw, I do think the events to follow will strengthen those parties and will be a big part of what you have to manage in Spain and Italy and Austria and across Europe. To be honest, I expect 4 years. I don't believe I believe there will be an impeachment of President Trump, but I don't believe there'll be a conviction of President Trump. I don't think the current Republican Party is capable of removing him. And in fact, conviction is, I'm sure, the way an impeachment trial is, I'm sure, the way he views as the way he would set up an election or re-election campaign against the forces that are trying to delegitimate him and his party. So I expect 4 years of a U.S. deepening alignment with Vladimir Putin. I see a movement toward a GX of some kind that includes Trump and Putin and Netanyahu and Viktor Orban and Giuseppe Conte and whatever other range of leaders emerge in Europe, I think we should expect what seems to be utterly impossible in terms of what the role America is playing in the next 4 years. I can see a break with the G7 on democratic values, on the collective response to the global problems the G7 was seeking to address. I can see in America that reduces its troop presence or withdraws its troop presence from the Korean Peninsula, from Syria, Afghanistan, and maybe even a reduction of forces in NATO. All of these things are possible. And there is no evidence that there is a Republican Party in America that seems willing to confront or check that direction led by the president, and I'll explain why. His principal strategist was Steve Bannon, who obviously has traveled extensively in the elections in Europe. Whether you advised him or not, he certainly was welcomed by the various parties that won across the region. And what Bannon has done, I think, as a strategist, and he was the strategist for the election at its close. He was the strategist for the transition. He was the strategist in the first months of the administration. But he draws on Trump's authentic hostility to the corrupt elites and business establishment, his hostility to China, immigrants, blacks. But he also fosters Trump's alignment with the Christian, religiously orthodox, and anti-Muslim forces in the U.S. He reinforces a Tea Party, kind of libertarian, strongly anti-government at all levels that leads to Trump's actively trying to deconstruct the state day by day to extraordinary effect. The advertisements they ran at the close, in some of my earlier writing after the election, I'd like to put the full text of Hillary Clinton's final 2-minute close. And I urge people, in fact, I've urged people in the Clinton campaign to explain to me what was your message in the campaign. But this was the closing ad, along with images of Soros and a whole variety of other Jewish financial leaders. Quote, "It's global power structure that is responsible for the economic decisions that have robbed our working class, stripped our country of its wealth, put that money into the pockets of a handful of large corporations and political entities. The only thing that can stop their corrupt machine is you." And so it was very much a populist, nationalist, anti-elite, anti-Semitic, and racist campaign that closed its and created its mandate for the Trump presidency. So Trump's surprising and disruptive election is very real. And there's no doubt that his support of nationalist, anti-establishment parties, will drive events affecting liberal democracy. But we also have to factor into the story about what's happening in real time with the American resistance to Trump, the anti-Trump forces producing an equally dramatic repudiation of the nationalist, racist, misogynistic government and party that Trump has created. We may be looking in very short order as big a tsunami against Trump and what he stands for in a very short period of time in the upcoming elections in November in 2018, but also in the elections in 2020. So as we think through what is the consequence, we don't just take what happened in the election and how it impacted the elections across Europe, and what Trump is likely to do. We have to look at the day-by-day struggle that's happening against Trump, and actually amongst Democrats, but also within his own party, and how that may well, and what the conclusion of that produces, and perhaps produces a new tidal wave. we should have in our head when we think about Trump is the 2010 Tea Party wave election against Barack Obama. That election produced a landslide reaction against the Affordable Care Act, big government, helping minorities, against Obama and what he represented. But it also produced a wave election in the year after, in the 2 years after Obama's election, that impacted the elections of governors. They ended up with control of 2/3 of the governors coming out of that election and control of most of the legislatures across the country. That had a decade-long effect on the country. Well, this is the election that's comparable to the Tea Party wave election of 2010, that if there is a comparable anti-Trump effect that is not just about Trump, but is about what he stands for and how he's tried to lead the Republican Party. What you need to understand about Trump is that he didn't just take over a Republican Party. He had a very specific strategy. He built his support with the Tea Party base first and foremost. That's the strong working class, anti-elite part of the party, most pro-gun, most anti-trade and globalization, and most hostile to Obama on race, and most hostile to the Affordable Care Act, expanding the role of government. So he began with building his base with the Tea Party. At the time we were polling, we showed how he surged, the Tea Party was about a quarter of the Republican Party, and he led that from the beginning. So there was no going away. He then, before he was achieved the nomination, built his base with the other quarter of the Republican Party, which was the evangelicals. So his base, which he formed a solid alignment, is with the Tea Party, anti-government, and the evangelical, religiously observant that dominated the Republican Party. By the way, they were half of the Republican Party. But the way he achieved the nomination, and he got about half the votes of the delegates going into the convention, was his dominance of those parts of the party. And what has surprised people since his election was his decision to govern with that base. And actually, even further, to go into the 2018 off-year elections with trying to gin up those voters as the basis for winning the election. Now, their very strong loyalty to him is very much part of why politicians opposing Trump have paid such a price. Because it's very clear how he's built that bond. If you look at what he's advocated as a candidate, he was a birther. He was the candidate that most challenged the legitimacy of the first African American president. He showed that he was most hostile to both Obama and Hillary Clinton. He launched his campaign as an anti-immigration campaign, first and foremost, talking about Mexican immigrants as murderers and rapists as his starting offer in his first campaign speeches. He made the building of the wall that'll be paid for by Mexico central, to his campaign. But everything he did forged Tea Party and evangelical, and as you watch what he's done with regard to the evangelicals, they got the first Supreme Court appointment, which is the thing they wanted most of all. He has, at every point, has tried to block funding for Planned Parenthood, and obviously, he has centered his governance in its first year on overturning, repealing the Affordable Care Act, and doing everything possible to make it fail. But all of that is grounded in his leading a party a portion of the party that is the Tea Party which is based in the Tea Party movement that opposed Obama and produced the Tea Party wave election in 2010, and the evangelicals, who are the two biggest blocs in the Republican Party. That was sufficient to win, and at no point did he reach out to other parts of the party. If we watched the convention after he was nominated, if you watch the way he is governed, there is no point in which he's done anything other than trying to maintain that loyalty. The consequence is he's been able to maintain a fairly steady base of support of about 40% of the electorate who approve of his performance. So he doesn't crash in the way George Bush crashed. But it is a strategy to govern by ginning up, building on the emotions of the Tea Party and most religious parts of the Republican Party, and that has allowed him to get to this point. There's no issue that you look at that cannot be looked at in that context. If you look at climate change, why he withdrew, why he's appointed the most anti-environment government possible. At every possible point, he's going after environmental science. If you look at who in the Republican Party is most opposed to the idea that human beings had a role in the warming of the planet, first are the evangelicals, who you can understand why granting that human role would be a contradiction to what they think is what drives global forces. But the other side of that are the Tea Party, who believe that the climate change is mostly a PC liberal academic idea to produce a big rise in government regulation and bigger government in trying to address and mitigate the effects of climate change. But so there is no issue that you look at and say how he has governed, that you don't go and look at where he has built up his base within the Republican Party. And understanding that piece of it enables you to understand how he's governed and how he's related to the world outside. Now, the problem with that is that it has nothing to do with the demographic and cultural trends of the country, and it has nothing to do with what Americans believe. America is going through seismic changes demographically, culturally, and has moved to dramatically new places on attitudes, on how it feels about immigration, diversity, gender roles, patriarchy. There is no area where America hasn't moved dramatically, and even more so since the battle, the 2016 battle with Donald Trump, where increasingly the great majority of the Americans who have used the exact opposite of what's being advanced by the government become increasingly conscious of what they believe. Things that they took for granted no longer take for granted. It's produced a polarized reaction to Donald Trump that has created a new level of resistance, new level of polarization, politicization, and very intense response. Let me put go through some graphs to illustrate what I'm saying, so you won't believe that I simply made this up. This is the Republican Party. This is the Republican Party, which is the most important thing to understand. And this is based on I think 4,000 interviews we did, but it's about 1,500 Republicans. This was done during the 2018 and I think a little bit of 2017. But these are all. This is all in the last 6 months, looking at the Republican Party. And what you see is that you have 26% who are evangelicals. We have 16% as Tea Party. We'll make some adjustments. I think that will become slightly larger. But what you see is that there are large parts of the Republican Party that are, you'll see, less enthusiastic. You'll see, based on data to come, less enthusiastic about where Donald Trump is trying to take the country. On the graph here, this is the closing argument that Steve Bannon's ad for the campaign that led and responded to these key elements. But the first thing that we look at is the approval ratings for Donald Trump. Now, what matters above all is the strong approval, or disapproval. Now, keep in mind also, this is an off-year election. This will be a relatively low turnout election. Every wave election that we've had, Watergate, the 2014 election, 2010 election, have all been the lowest turnout elections since World War II, or during World War II. And what drives wave elections is differential enthusiasm of different parts of the electorate. And what you see is that Trump has driven his strong approval with evangelicals to 62% and Tea Party to 59%. Which is very high. There's an overall approval is I'm sure at 90% or more. But what matters is the strong approval. That's what drives turnout. If you look at Catholic conservatives, it's a little bit lower. And there's more secular conservatives are at 52%. That's 10 points below. But the moderate Republicans, and just remember, moderate Republicans are a quarter of the Republicans. There's as many moderates as evangelicals. They are at only 32%, strong approval. But you also have to understand what's happening with Democrats, where you have 75% strong disapproval. So you don't just have a leader of the Republican Party being a very partisan. He is running as a Tea Party, anti-government, anti-immigration, religious-based candidacy against Islam, as centering his candidacy. The effect of that, which is producing 62% and 59% strong approval in his base, is producing 75% strong disapproval amongst Democrats. So the definition of the party is having an anti-Trump effect with Democrats, and that part you can see. It wouldn't be as strong if he was just being partisan, but he's defining the party in a certain way, and it's producing a very strong Democratic reaction. But we also have to watch the Republican reaction, which is producing a lack of enthusiasm or strong support for the president, where the moderate Republicans are better educated, are more recognize climate change, are pro-choice on abortion, favor gay marriage. They're a quarter of the Republicans, so that there's a double effect. When the more Trump goes out and beats the drum that he says is for the base, people are misreading that the base is more complicated in the Republican Party, and part of why 2018 has the prospect to be a wave election is because not just of Democratic enthusiasm, which almost everybody is looking at, they're failing to look at Republican enthusiasm because the base does not, doesn't include everyone. Let me just, give some history to how Trump, got to this, position. He built up, strong anti-trade support, kind of working class, support. That's very much important to the Tea Party vote that he got. If you look at what happened with white working class men, you're looking at him driving the anti-trade position by the last election to 61%, 2-to-1 opposition. But you should note that there's other parts of America. College-educated population strongly favor trade agreements. That is, he's driving a portion of the electorate with him. The working class base is more likely to be within the Republican Party and more likely to be within the Tea Party. What Trump has done has produced a flip on trade. So it used to be that this is a thermometer score from 0 to 100. This is the mean thermometer score on reactions to NAFTA. What you see is it used to be that Republicans were more pro-NAFTA, more pro-trade than Democrats. But what's happened leading into the 2016 election, and particularly as Trump began to champion his opposition to trade agreements, is that the Republicans have dropped to a mean of 35.6, which is very low, but it's produced a Democrats in favor of trade, which is the opposite, obviously, of where the administration is moving. So everything that's happening governmentally is reinforcing the energy and engagement of Democrats. Now that does support the working class again, but he is driving up Tea Party and evangelical support. Okay. But we need to remember where the country is. I'm going to focus on immigration. I mentioned earlier, America is becoming more secular, more immigrant. 40% of America's cities of New York, Los Angeles, are foreign-born. There's been a surge of foreign-born populations, surge into the suburbs, surge into the cities. A very high proportion of foreign postgraduate students stay and get visas. So America has become increasingly foreign-born with an accelerating rate. So America is becoming more secular, more immigrant. A majority of Americans are unmarried. I think it's now 3/4 of women are the sole or major breadwinner in households in America. I'm just throwing these out, but just to highlight the context in which Trump is trying to battle for the traditional family, battle to preserve a more Anglo-Saxon American against immigrant diversity. Okay. This is a question asked by Pew, which is a choice that asks whether immigrants strengthen the country and their hard work and benefits, or whether immigrants are a burden because they take jobs, housing, and health care. Couldn't be a clearer choice. I doubt that you would find many countries with two pieces here. So you have 2/3, I think it's 65% of Americans who say they are a benefit to the country. So understand that the context as you're watching Trump, in each case failing. In the Virginia campaign last year, they closed the campaign with ads talking about the gangs and immigrants that were murdering Americans. They did that in the Pennsylvania special election. Their strategy now appears to be that that's what they're planning to do in the upcoming, election. But the context has to be where you. The context has to be where there's actually it's almost a norm that Americans think we're an immigrant country and immigration is good for the country, and that's the context in which he's dealing with. And if you look at by party, I'll come polarization at a later point in the graphs. But I tried to look at the things that he's doing, like pulling out of the Paris Climate Agreement, threatening to pull out of NAFTA, the Iran agreement. But if you look at where the country is, this is where by party, but the overall number is 60% say that we ought to be making sacrifices, compromises to get along with our allies. The president has moved in the opposite direction. When we ask about the environment, you see a huge, 2-to-1 again, bigger than that we need increased regulation. Again, with a huge partisan divide with 77% of Democrats. When we ask about climate change, there's been a 13-point increase in people believing it that it's happening. You have 50% overall that say it's, I think it's 53% saying it's real and human. But if you look at by party, for Democrats, it's 78% say it's humans, whereas I think it's 5% with Republicans. So you're dealing with a 3-to-1 gap on believing it. Shroom. Just whether what we think about racial equality, right now, overwhelmingly and increasingly, the country thinks we need to do more to achieve racial equality. So if you look at the way this government is operating, again, obviously with partisan polarization, and by the way, every single chart is year-on-year increase in the numbers saying we're more immigrant, we need to address issues of racial injustice. What's happening with the Trump's election is during the election and afterwards, there's been a shift on every measure we're looking at in which the country has become more open to democratic liberal values, which is, frankly, on many of these are high enough to be a norm. This is the percentage who think that affirmative action is a good or bad thing. In 2017, it was 71% a good thing and increasing. So more government action to address it. When we ask about whether business corporations have too much profit, again, we see where those numbers are going, even though we had a tax bill that was the opposite direction. When we ask whether the economic system is fair or not, and if you look at the left side, you're looking at the 65%, 2-to-1, who say the economic system is unfair. But let me pause on this slide. The NBC Wall Street Journal asks a question where they ask, should the government do more to solve problems and help meet the needs of people, or whether too many things have been left, more things should be left to business and individuals? What you're watching is a surge in people to say we need more government. And again, every year that Trump is in office produces a higher number, producing the opposite direction from where Trump is going. The result has been of all this is a huge polarization of the electorate. This is the attitude of each party toward the other. It used to be that you were hostile to the other party, but now it has huge intensity, and that's reciprocal on the side of each party. You now have Republicans wanting to live in rural areas and Democrats wanting to live in urban areas, but also the population growth is out of, including last year, continues to be and will always be out of the rural areas and into the suburban and urban areas. And so the consequence of all this, of this huge gap between what's happening demographically and the attitudes of people in the country, as you look to the midterm elections, is the question of how interested are you, in this election. This is a measure of the top level of interest on a 10-point scale on all our efforts at verification. This is the one that's most highly correlated with actually turning out at elections. And so what's coming out of the way he's governing as a Trump Tea Party evangelical president, he's pushed the Democratic highest level to 52%. Now that matches the evangelicals. So his strategy is working for evangelicals and is close with the Tea Party. But then it drops for the non-religious conservatives, drops sharply for the conservative Catholics and moderates. It drops to 38% and 37%, so the huge gap on turning out in the election on the Catholic conservatives and moderates, who are about almost 40% of Republicans. And so that I view that number as my best guide and hope on what kind of election we will have. So the issue becomes, do we end up with an election in 2018, and maybe 20, but at 18, that looks like the 2010 Tea Party wave, and remembering, 2/3 of the governors are up this year, and 80% of the state legislators are up this year. So that if there is a wave anti-Trump election, you're talking about an anti-Trump wave that gets reflected in governors and legislatures who are also willing to act, as we've watched now in New York and California, and cities like Seattle and elsewhere, where they have moved to take action to reinforce where the country really is. But if you have that kind of election, will you have a tsunami that begins to affect what happens in Europe? What's happening with Trump is that he's so misaligned with the trends of the country, he is so misaligned with the attitudes, that there's a basis for the opposition mobilizing against. And this is, by the way, this isn't just a reflection of attitudes. There's been this huge resistance, beginning with the Women's March the day after the election, which was an attempt to delegitimate his election, followed by a surge of women candidates who now not only have run, but have also won their primaries, so that half of the Democrats running in this election congressionally are women. So you have this gender flip. You've also had the Parkland students and the walkouts at the schools over gun violence, which has also produced an effect and engagement, of millennials. You've also had the Tea Party-like disruption of town meetings on the Affordable Care Act to prevent them from repealing the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, which was also very much a visual part, but an organizing part. So we've watched over a year now, of resistance that has grown and come in different ways. But this number, which reflects where we are now, came out of a growing resistance and action that has set up the election. The problem for Europe is the opposition in Hungary, so delegitimated? Is the system so rigged? Is the media so unworkable that one can't break through? Has the period of governance in Italy of the Democratic Party, which did not really produce any serious income gains for most, are they too illegitimate to play a part? What is the role of the forces that are opposed to the nationalist and anti-establishment parties? Are they so feckless and illegitimate, and the process so non-democratic that they are still free to govern? We're doing our part. I believe we'll do our part. 4 months, we'll see whether this holds up. But I think America is poised to send a very big message on where it stands on democratic values and where it stands on sexist, nationalist, anti-establishment parties that don't understand the country. The challenge now, I believe, is if there is such a tsunami, are the forces there on the ground in Europe that they can create a new kind of politics that can change the game there as well. Thank you very much.